1889, the Socialist International was founded to continue from the groundwork that Marx and Engels had originally laid in the First International to try to build an international workers' party. Since capitalism is a world system, they recognized the need for internationalism in theory. But the Second International presided over a substantial economic boom, and there were real improvements made in the lives of working people over this period. The parties in the Second International grew massively and were able to get party leaders elected and even pass a lot of reforms and improvements for working people. But its popularity also meant that people began to see it as an attractive political career option and not a vehicle for revolution. And so the transformation of these parties happened pretty quietly under the surface until, without people really knowing what was going on, until Edward Bernstein opened up the debate on reform or revolution, which Rosa Luxemburg famously polemicized against, though unfortunately she found herself in a minority. Still, the degree to which the Socialist International had degenerated came as a shock to many, including Lenin. Criminally, when the fact of World War I was presented to them, the leaders of the parties in the Socialist International chose to support their own ruling classes on national lines. And these, again, were huge parties with ministers elected into parliaments, and they voted in favor of imperialist war for the sake of national unity and party discipline. And so in 1914, and all throughout the war, it was shown that these so-called socialists were more determined to preserve their own careers within a capitalist state apparatus and party bureaucracy than they were interested in socialism or revolution. And thus, they were actually hell-bent on preventing revolution rather than leading one. And this betrayal is an inevitable result of reformism, of constraining your ideas within the framework of capitalism. So the betrayal of the socialist parties in the Second International and the surge in communist movements triggered by the Russian Revolution meant that a new international could be built and had to be built, essentially. One which condemned the opportunist leaders and stood for real internationalism and for world revolution. The Communist International, or the Comintern as it was called, was declared in 1918, and the first Congress took place in 1919. And its purpose was to unite the advanced elements of the working class, for them to come together and share their experiences, provide constructive criticism to each other, and take decisions and move together. The international ruling class was united in their opposition to Bolshevism. The only way to counter it was international working class unity. So in 1918 and 1919, in Finland, Italy, Germany, the socialist parties actually saved the bourgeoisie from mass movements, betrayed the working class, and paved the way for counter-revolution. At the same time, communist parties crystallized rapidly in country after country, making up tens of thousands of people who were rightly disgusted by the opportunism of the socialist parties, as well as that of the trade unions, and were eager to go beyond those social democratic limits and to revolutionary communism. But in 1920, 3/4 of the Socialist Party of France voted to join the Comintern, splitting away from their leadership, forming the Communist Party of France. They began with 110,000 members. In Germany, the USPD grew from 300,000 to 800,000 from 1919 to 1920. In Italy, the process was a little bit more protracted, but ultimately the ultra-left communist Amedeo Bordiga split off from the Socialist Party with about 60,000 members, which was about half of the Socialist Party. And if they had stayed, they might have been able to win over nearly everyone. But the rapid growth and splits in the births of these communist parties were entirely due to the rapid changes in the objective situation. Every month, nearly every day, there were new developments that called for changing tactics, requiring an offensive here, a retreat there. The rate at which the masses were also testing out different programs, parties, and leaders was really fast-paced and erratic, learning from experience. So Practically all of these brand new communist parties were characterized by impatience. They saw the already accomplished revolution in Russia and wanted to hasten their own revolution. And because so many of them came out of the Second International in their attempt to cleanse themselves of the sin of opportunism, they took rigid positions on the question of whether or not, and not how, to participate in elections and in unions. And they firmly rejected any engagement in one or both of them. So Bordiga in Italy, for example, rejected any participation in elections altogether, as well as the trade unions, and the Germans had a similar attitude. And this was a tendency in the British Communist Party as well, even though it did not form out of like a mass socialist party. It was a much smaller group and also very young. But they were basically, all of these groups were turning a question of tactics into a question of principle, whether or not communists should do X in any particular circumstance, right? So Lenin addresses these new communist parties with patience and a pedagogical tone. His intention isn't to denounce or expel them, as he was very much trying to do with some of the worst of the opportunists. He was confident that with guidance and through practical experience that they would learn. Infantile in left-wing communism and infantile disorder is not a pejorative term. It's a neutral adjective describing the actual age of these communist parties, and to a large extent the age of some of the members. However, while the Comintern ballooned in membership, so did the major unions, and so did the socialist parties of the Second International, despite its track record of betrayal. So trade union membership in Britain doubled between 1914 and 1920. In Germany, the explicitly socialist trade unions grew by 4 million people in 1 year. And in Italy, 2 million joined the socialist-led Trade Union Confederation. In France, union membership went from 400,000 to 2 million by 1919. So the ultralefts were proposing leaving the unions precisely when millions of workers were entering them. So what this minority of hundreds of thousands in the Comintern had learned about the nature of reformism and its treachery, the masses had not yet understood, had not yet come to the conclusion. As different layers of the working class draw conclusions at different times. And this progression is not linear. There are ebbs and sudden eruptions. And reformism appears as the easier path always, right up until it doesn't, right? Right up until there's a sharp break. So left-wing communists, or ultralefts, were very impatient with this learning process that the masses were going through. And they also had the idea that they could simply call the masses to them with a few revolutionary slogans, or even just by repeating the phrase "all power to the Soviets," literally just that, and the march to victory would just be continuously moving forward, uninterrupted, and that to conceive of anything else would be opportunists. And in their eagerness to condemn the betrayals of the reformist leaders, they condemned the whole working class that had illusions in reforms still. So the method of ultraleftism is really to reduce things to simple formulas and doesn't accept objective reality, but imposes wishful thinking on the world. So Lenin wrote left-wing communism in order to teach revolutionaries how to strategize, to teach them the method of thinking for themselves which tactics are appropriated under what circumstances, because no slogan is inherently correct under all conditions. And we must take into account our forces and the development of class consciousness, the masses, and not just a layer of them, in some of these calculations.